Welcome to Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Clauser, with the Center Square's Western Washington reporter, Spencer Polly. Now, Spencer, you wrote about Seattle's budget situation this week. It looks like they're coming up a little bit short on what they're expecting for the next 2 years, uh, maybe just shy or a little bit more than $240 million. Now, to
That's
some,
a
that
little
might be a
bit.
little bit. To some, that might be a lot. So why don't you run us through how they got here and what might happen?
How do we get here, Watson? That's a big question right now. Look, let me just set some background here. So yes, Seattle just released its April forecast for 2025, 2026 revenues, and 241.5 million less than previously thought is not good. And this, for context, they have two different forecasts here. They have a baseline forecast and they have a pessimistic forecast. I have never seen the city officials go off of the pessimistic forecast before until last week when they went in their meeting and talked about this. This is the first time I've seen it. And all this, to answer your question, Tim, is due to global economic certainty. The lack of, I should say. So we're seeing tariffs, slower growth of the economy, and weakened sales and use taxes, business and occupation taxes, all of which have contributed to that huge drop in expected revenue. And when you have something like this happen, it causes a huge shift for how the city operates. Immediately after this was announced, Seattle Mayor Bruce Harrell announced that they will continue their hiring freeze. They're going to look at cutting spending for unnecessary spending, I should say. This includes equipment upgrades, spending on travel, whatnot. And then what are we going to see in September when Mayor Harrell looks at his proposed budget, adjustments for 2026? When you see this big of a difference in revenue, it shifts a lot. And, without saying I know for certain, you're going to see cuts. And the city of Seattle they have not sugarcoated the potential impacts of a loss of revenue. And this April forecast is not the first time. Last October, the most recent forecast they did for revenues, they also had bad news within that. And so this is just continuing, but with more economic uncertainty.
Now, you say that this $240 million pitfall is due to the tariffs, which is, I mean, the tariffs are going to have impacts on local, state, the federal economy. It's going to happen in varying degrees. But you mentioned last October, they knew things weren't looking great. And that was before the Trump was even elected for a second term. I mean, last year, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the city of Seattle was also in a budget crisis over $200 million, and they solved it with a payroll tax that came up significantly short. So can you elaborate on, I mean, how is this due to the tariffs when they had the same issue last year? They passed a new tax and it didn't do as good as they thought, but now it's Trump's fault. Not that the tariffs don't have an impact, but
Right.
is there not some blame there?
That is a good question, Tim. I think when they mean that the tariffs impact this, it's just the volatility.
Volatility.
Thank you. That's a hard word for me to say. The volatility of the national economy, including with tariffs. When we have pausing of these tariffs and then we resume it, it just, as I think we're just seeing with the stock exchange right now, the numbers are going up and down, up and down. We don't know what's happening next. No one's quite certain what Trump's going to do next. I think even with that, it really impacts the city just with predicting where revenues are going to be. And to answer your question about, how has this impacted the payroll tax last year, which was able to save the city from that $250 million budget deficit. Well, that payroll tax really relies dependently on stocks of these big businesses. 75% of revenue from the payroll expense tax comes from 10 companies, and they are mostly in the tech sector. That's why this payroll expense tax is like also dubbed the Amazon tax. It goes for Amazon, it goes for Meta, it goes for Microsoft, Google. There you go. That's a huge tech sector right there based in Seattle. Now, that now that revenue dropped considerably last year, and this was after the revenue was already put into the budget. So the budget was closed off for last year, for this year, I should say, with that jumpstart payroll tax. But now revenue is going to continue to decrease. Jumpstart payroll tax expense revenue is going to decrease by 167.4 million through 2026, less than was expected. That is a huge drop. And you can say it's because of tariffs and the stock exchange and the relation there. But another reason, and this was brought up by Seattle City Council Chair Sarah Nelson, these businesses are moving away. And that's something I've covered. It's not a surprise, but a lot of these tech employees are moving across Lake Washington over to Bellevue, where they have all these offices. And that also has a huge impact on the revenue generated from this. And so it also shows the volatility of the tax.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it reminds me of what's going on at the state legislature right now with the $16 billion deficit that they're forecasted over the next 4 years. And Democrats wanted to largely save that or pull us out of that deficit with a new wealth tax, which would tax the wealthiest companies in the world that operate out of Washington state. Now, Ferguson promised to veto that because he said, look, we don't want this, our pulling us out of this deficit to be reliant on an entirely new tax, which kind of seems like what happened in Seattle. Now, while the payroll tax didn't do as good as they thought in the first year, the projections might have showed them scathing by, maybe give or take a little bit. But I mean, the tariffs, did it just upend those projections altogether? It seems like, okay, under the old projections, they were fine. But now with these tariffs, it's just thrown them for a huge curve where, I mean, projections today look like they could be terrible. But if we have another market high day tomorrow, that could change things.
It's just the uncertainty of it. You know, what's going to happen next? I would say the tariffs weren't the main reason why we're seeing this huge drop in revenue projections, but it does play a factor. And that's why I think the city is looking at that pessimistic forecast because of all of this. Now, they didn't say we're predicting a recession scenario here, but there is going to be a scenario where revenue projections reflect the ongoing uncertainty. They're right there. And that's just based on the national economy, the ripples of tariffs, whatnot, whatever happens next in the national economy. They are prepping for just that uncertainty. And that's what Mayor Harrell also noted when he said in a press release is like, we were preparing for a scenario where this kind of economy could happen. Now, did the preparations work? I don't know. To me, I think they're probably just going to look at how they're going to reduce spending. And that's going to be huge chunks of revenue to different departments, maybe for essential services. That's expected Seattle. It's expected at King County, and I assume it's expected much elsewhere in Washington. But, you know, the tariffs, it's going to play a factor, whether or not it's there just because of what we're seeing right now in the stock exchange. I mean, I'm seeing numbers pop up and down all the time here, mostly down, but we'll see what happens next. As I was writing this, I wrote currently, you know, Trump announced a 90-day pause on reciprocal tariffs with the exception of China. I was afraid when we hit publish, something might change again. That graph might be a little dated. So that's where we're at right now.
Yeah, it's definitely very uncertain, the back and forth, no matter what side a big metro might lean on, whether they're more left leaning or right leaning, they're all running into this issue where, you know, even just in the last 3 or 4 months since January when Trump took office, it's changed things entirely. And you're saying, Mayor Harrell, he's planning for the worst economic situation possible. I mean, it makes me wonder what the future holds, because today there might be tariffs. Tomorrow there could be a pause. The next day they could come back. What if the Trump administration is unrelenting with this and they don't get those trade offers back that they're hoping, and then it just leaves some of the biggest metros in the country crippling under this pressure? But definitely something we'll stay on top of as this story continues over the next few years with the new Trump administration. But thank you, Spencer, for covering this story for us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us on another episode of Washington in Focus.